pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Well, thank you all for coming. I want to begin at the beginning with my book in two ways. The first is just to acknowledge my own debt to the Library of Congress as a research venue. I did do a lot of research here in 2006 as a Kluge Fellow, right downstairs in the manuscripts room in this very building. And I found it an incredibly rewarding place to work, and the resources here are really tremendous. So in a way, I'm beginning at the beginning in that sense in terms of my research process. But I'd also like to begin at the beginning in my talk by reading to you from the very beginning of the book. And what I plan to do in my talk today is talk a bit about the book and read a little bit for you and then entertain any questions that you might have. There were two sides in the American Revolution, but only one was on display early in the afternoon of November 25th, 1783, when General George Washington rode on a gray horse into New York City. By his side trotted the governor of New York, flanked by an escort of mounted guards. Portly General Henry Knox followed close behind, leading officers of the Continental Army 8 abreast down the Bowery. Long lines of civilians trailed after them, some on horseback, others on foot, wearing black and white cockades and sprigs of laurel in their hats. Hundreds crammed into the streets to watch as the choreographed procession made its way down to the Battery at Manhattan's southern tip. Since 1776, through 7 long years of war and peace negotiations, New York had been occupied by the British Army. Today, the British were going. A cannon shot at 1 p.m. sounded the departure of the last British troops from their posts. They marched onto the docks, they clambered into longboats, and they rowed out to the transports waiting in the harbor. The British occupation of the United States was officially over. George Washington's triumphal entrance into New York City was the closest thing that the winners of the American Revolution ever had to a victory parade. For a week, patriots celebrated the evacuation with feasts and bonfires, illuminations, and the biggest fireworks display ever staged in North America. Generations of New Yorkers commemorated November 25th as Evacuation Day, an anniversary that was later folded into the more enduring November celebration of national togetherness, Thanksgiving Day. And you can see a bit of a representation of this in the image that I'm showing on the screen for you here. It's a 19th century picture of Evacuation Day. I'm not entirely sure who the artist behind this is, but it gives you some flavor of the degree to which this remained an event in people's national memory. But what if you hadn't wanted the British to leave? Mixed in among the happy crowd that day, there were other, less cheerful faces. For loyalists, colonists who had sided with Britain during the war, the departure of the British troops spelled worry, not jubilation. During the war, tens of thousands of loyalists had moved for safety into New York and other British-held cities. The British withdrawal now raised urgent questions about their future. What kind of treatment could they expect in the new US? Would they be jailed? Would they be attacked? Would they retain their property? Would they hold on to their jobs? Facing real doubts about their lives, liberty, and potential happiness in the United States, 60,000 loyalists decided to follow the British and take their chances elsewhere in the British Empire. They traveled to Canada, they sailed for Britain, they journeyed to the Bahamas and the West Indies. Some would venture still farther afield to Africa and to India. But wherever they went, this voyage into exile was a trip into the unknown. In America, the refugees left behind friends and relatives, careers and land, houses and native streets, the entire milieu in which they had spent their lives. For them, America did not seem an asylum for the persecuted, but rather a potential persecutor. It was the British Empire that would be their asylum, offering land, emergency relief, and financial incentives to help them start over. Evacuation Day did not mark an end for the Loyalist refugees. It was a fresh beginning, and it carried them into a dynamic, if uncertain, new world. So in my book, I set out to explain what happened to them next. And I should say, in the book, I try to distill the stories of these 60,000 refugees who leave the United States, representing about 1 in 40 members of the population. So this is really the biggest mass transfer of population we have, I think, civilian population in US history. So I try to distill these stories into some kind of meaningful overview. And in the course of my talk today, I'm going to be even more grossly reductionist, because I'm going to focus on just one of these lives, that of a woman from Georgia called Elizabeth Johnston. But before I do that, let me just sort of sketch out for you a little bit about the bigger picture in which these life stories that I've tried to piece together are set. Now, stereotypes still suggest that loyalists belonged to a particular elite profile, that they were white, that they were wealthy, that they were Anglican, that they were Anglo-centric. In truth, however, this stereotype does not capture the full range of loyalism. In truth, loyalism reached right across the social, geographic, religious, and ethnic spectrum of early America. It included, in particular, some 20,000 black slaves who responded to promises of freedom that were made to them by British authorities if they joined British forces, ran away from their Patriot owners, joined the British, got freedom, and are known collectively as black loyalists. So we have about 20,000 of them, half of whom survive to go into exile to become refugees, but free refugees at the end of the war. Another category of people who were included among the ranks of loyalists were Native Americans. Many American Indian nations who had been harassed for generations by land-hungry colonists saw their own self-interest best represented by joining the British, and a number of Native American nations did go with the British during the war, including most notably the Mohawks of upstate New York, who would ultimately be rewarded by land grants in Canada and move there. And finally, I should say that loyalists were by no means consistently Tory. We often use this label Tory as a synonym for loyalism, as patriots did back in the day. But in fact, this label, which is the nickname for the British Conservative Party, is very inaccurate in terms of representing loyalist belief, inasmuch as loyalists were not simply pat conservatives by any sense of the meaning of the word that we would have today. In fact, many loyalists advanced their own dynamic political visions for a future for the colonies in the British Empire. And I think the point that I think is lost when we refer to loyalists as Tories is the fact that for many people who were caught on the front lines of the American Revolution, this was a civil war. Plain and simple. It was a civil war, which they called it a civil war. That was the word they used for it. It wasn't a war for them so much of ideals, as we tend to celebrate it today, as much as it was a war of ordeals, a war in which violence came to their front doors, in which they might have their windows smashed, their livestock poisoned, their property seized by the state. And I think it's violence, at least as much as ideology, that helps explain why people made the choices they did, and above all, that helps explain why these tens of thousands of loyalists ended up taking refuge in British-held cities during the war and becoming refugees at the war's end. So what happened next, and where did they all go? Well, I have here a map. This is a sort of clumsy version of a map you'll find in the front of the book, which indicates something of the range of the destinations that loyalists reached. Fewer than 15% of the loyalist refugees actually went back to Britain. And I put back in these silly scare quotes because it wasn't really back for most of them. Very few of them had ever been to Britain in the first place. More than half the loyalists, in fact, ended up relocating to Eastern Canada, British North America, as it was then called. Meanwhile, another 10,000 or so, especially from the southern colonies, ended up moving to Jamaica and the Bahamas, and they brought with them large numbers of slaves who remained enslaved. Up to 15,000 slaves were exported by loyalist refugees, mostly to the south. And some loyalists actually ranged still further afield, as you can glean a bit perhaps by the little trail marks on the map, which indicate the trails of some of the people I write about in the book. Most surprisingly, and the most surprising significant branch of this migration, nearly 1,200 black loyalists moved in 1791 to West Africa under the sponsorship of British abolitionists, and they found there the utopian settlement of Freetown in Sierra Leone. And I want to give a shout out here, actually. There's an expert on black loyalists here in the audience, Freddie Cole, who is a musician who's done an album called Black Loyalist, which tells the story of some of these figures. This was the most, far-ranging, significant piece of the migration, but there are loyalists who end up scattered all over the expanding British world. Some end up on the first fleet to Botany Bay in Australia as convicts, which is a sort of unfortunate happening for them. Some end up, in fact, in India, which is booming as the site of British imperial interest in the wake of the American Revolution. And a number of people end up in India, including two sons of Benedict Arnold, perhaps the most infamous loyalist out there. And I think this turn toward India is nicely illustrated by the fate of none other than General Lord Cornwallis, who you probably know of as the man who lost the American Revolution by surrendering at Yorktown in 1781. But Cornwallis actually went on to have a fairly illustrious career as a British imperial administrator. He was appointed Governor General of India, a position which he held twice, and on the second term in the early 1800s, Cornwallis actually died in India, and he is buried here in this tomb, which looks like it might be on the grounds of a British country estate, but is in fact on the banks of the Ganges. Now, this points to one of the key features that I want to signal about the significance of the Loyalist diaspora writ large, because I think above all, it really helps make sense of a seeming paradox in the history of the British Empire. The American Revolution was the greatest defeat for Britain until the era of World War II. It was, a humiliating defeat kind of in the national psychology. It left Britain reeling under incredible debts. It was the largest loss of territory for the British Empire as well, again, until well into the 20th century. And yet, within a very short period of time, the British Empire had bounced back to an extraordinary extent. It was the British Empire, not the United States, that would be the leading world power for the 19th century. So how did this happen? How did the British Empire go so quickly from this terrible defeat to being in a position to sally forth into global dominion in the century to come? Well, understanding this is actually one of the reasons that I wrote this book. And the answers, I think, have to do with the fact that Britain was a good loser. It responded to the defeat in America by consolidating a set of practices and principles for its rule going forward that I call collectively the spirit of 1783. It was this spirit, I think, that really defined the British Empire going forward. It included various elements which I won't belabor now, but just to say that it included territorial expansion. One feature of that map of the Loyalist diaspora is that it looks a lot like the map of the British Empire as a whole, an expanding entity in this period. The first scheme to settle Australia is put forward by an American loyalist. And the British Empire also came out of this experience with a clarified sense of imperial purpose by an American loyalist. And the British Empire also came out of this experience with a clarified sense of imperial purpose. On the one hand, a commitment to kind of moral and humanitarian principles in various ways, manifested, among other things, by a commitment, increasing commitment to abolitionism. And at the same time, the British Empire responded to the defeat in America by becoming a more centralized, hierarchical, and authoritarian entity, wanting to ward off exactly the kinds of problems that had undone its rule in America. So all of these phenomena, the spirit of 1783, are really made manifest by the life experiences of the Loyalist refugees. But to give you a flavor of how all this worked, I want to use the rest of my time to sketch out for you one of the many stories of individual people that I tell in the book, because I really think this, I'm very committed to the idea of using human experience to understand how historical events unfold. And the person that I want to talk to you about is actually the first person that I came across in my research for this book. Her name was Elizabeth Johnston, and she wrote a memoir of her experiences in the early, in the mid-19th century, which I came across, as I say, early in my research. And it was reading her memoir that I really realized, oh, there's a book here. And her story sort of weaves in and out of my book, but let me piece it together for you as best as I can, and I'll read little bits to you from the book as well. I can give you an image of her while I begin to talk about her. So she was 12 years old when the war began. She was born in Georgia. Her father was a minor government official in Georgia, and they lived on a plantation outside of Savannah in a childhood that Elizabeth really remembered as this kind of Edenic, paradisical experience surrounded by, flowering fruit trees and all of that kind of thing. But the coming of the revolution really inverted her world. In 1776, a band of patriots came to the plantation, came to her father's doorstep, demanding that he basically go to their side and surrender some of his property to them. He refused. He ran away. He managed to escape from the plantation and go off and join British forces instead. For the next several years, Elizabeth Johnston, 12 years old, her mother had died when she was younger. She had no siblings. She's left alone while her father is at war. She moves from one relative to a family friend and so on through the early years of the war, and is finally reunited with her father in 1779 when the British launch a campaign through the American South. So at this time, they haven't seen one another for several years. She's no longer 12. She's now a young woman by contemporary standards, aged 15. And promptly, she falls in love with one of her father's brother officers. Her father is really not happy about this because he knows that the brother officer is a very dashing, and you know the connotations of dashing captain, 10 years older than young Elizabeth. He had trained as a medical student before the war, but has gone into the service and is a gambler and as a flirt and very not the kind of guy you want your 15-year-old daughter to get involved with. But nevertheless, these two get married. Elizabeth marries William Johnston, fellow Georgia loyalist, and together they embark on their married life. Well, the beginning of their married life together happens against the backdrop of Britain's losing war in the colonies, the future United States. And it is against this backdrop that Elizabeth Johnston begins what will be her very long migration as a refugee and an exile. They go from Savannah to Charleston as the British withdraw from Savannah and go to Charleston. Meanwhile, some of the other family members begin to disperse to further places. So let me read you a little bit about some of the evacuation scenes that are taking place in these years at the very end of the Revolution. Elizabeth and William Johnston joined the fleet from Savannah to Charleston. It was an unusual choice for Elizabeth to go to Charleston with William rather than to St. Augustine with her in-laws, not least because she was then 7 months pregnant, and she passed up the offer from a Patriot friend of William's to stay in Savannah under his protection until she was, quote, fitter for moving, unquote. But the Johnstons had already been apart for much of their short married life, as William is campaigning at war, and Elizabeth wanted no more of it. She had suffered the loneliness of raising their firstborn son, Andrew, a handsome, sweet fellow with a large proportion of his father's passionate temper, while William was away at war, and she had acquired another reason to wish William close at hand, for beyond her watch, William had fallen into his old habit of gambling. A vice so destructive and ruinous in its nature, she said, that it threatened to wreck their growing family. What was worse, William's behavior opened a rift with his own father and sisters. "You know not how wretched you have made me," Elizabeth opined, "and 'tis cruel to distress a father whose sole wish and care is to see his children happy." Dr. Lewis Johnston, William's father, with his wealth and influential connections, was not a man to be alienated lightly. A rift with him would cut off the young couple from their best source of support and patronage. So, when British power collapsed around her in Savannah, Elizabeth Johnston followed her impulse and her spouse. "My husband would not like the separation, and I positively refused to remain." Not once did she mention the issues of principle involved in leaving her home. In her own telling, Johnston did not leave for reasons of political sentiment, but for emotional ones, the bond of conjugal love. Well, the Johnstons arrived in Charleston to find that city, too, in the throes of pre-evacuation mayhem. Day in, day out, British officials coped with shortages of food, rum, ships, and cash, rising disorder, and falling morale, and more than 10,000 civilians clamoring for relief and reassurance. Elizabeth Johnston gave birth to the couple's first daughter, Catherine, in the comfort of a stately sequestered house. Around her in the emptying city, quote, "everything is in motion and turned topsy-turvy. It is impossible to describe what confusion people of all denominations seem to be in," one soldier noted. "The one is buying everything he can to complete his stock of goods. The second is searching for a passage to some other garrison of His Majesty's troops. The third is going from house to house to collect his debts." In early December 1782, Elizabeth Johnston stepped into a small boat with her toddler son, infant daughter, and a black nurse, and rowed out to the harbor to board an East Florida-bound schooner. It was like cruising into a jigsaw puzzle. Above her loomed the curved wooden walls of a city afloat, dark with slime and tar, the outlines of figures scurrying along decks and rigging, canvas sails stretched on a lattice of masts. Skiffs and rowboats traced ripples across the water, ferrying loyalists and slaves, barrels of food and supplies, furniture and livestock, even the valuable bells of St. Michael's Church. More than 1,200 white loyalists and 2,600 blacks plashed out to join a convoy bound for Jamaica. Another group of black loyalist soldiers gathered to sail for St. Lucia. A few hundred individuals, including various government officials, joined a convoy for Britain. Finally, on the afternoon of December 12th, the soldiers began assembling on the city wharfs to board the transports for New York. 2 days later, the Americans formally reoccupied Charleston, while the Johnstons swayed out to sea in opposite directions. William with his garrison to New York City, Elizabeth to join the rapidly growing Loyalist community in East Florida. Now, this Loyalist exodus to East Florida was quite substantial. East Florida at that time remained a British colony. It was held out to the Loyalist refugees as a very promising place for them to go and try to reestablish their plantations, especially for slave owners. It's Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, they're all close to each other. It made sense as a place for them to go. And so they went there thinking they could basically just restart their lives there with British support behind them. So it was that much more devastating when they arrived in Florida, only to discover that in the terms of the peace treaty that ended the war, East Florida was going to be handed over to Spain. And they felt that the British government, who had held out this asylum for them, had pulled the rug out from under them, making them become refugees once more. And this would be the plight that Elizabeth Johnston and her growing family would soon face. And as she said, the war never occasioned half the distress which this peace has done to the unfortunate loyalists. No other provision made than just recommending them to the clemency of Congress, which is in fact casting them off altogether. You know, you can't trust Congress for anything. And this kind of went on. There was enormous depression and devastation among the loyalists in East Florida. At a dinner a few nights after this terrible news arrived, one loyalist recalled the emotional reaction when the assembled refugees drank to the king's health. How the king must have felt had he seen the company. Two of the gentlemen were so much agitated that they covered their faces with their handkerchiefs, but they could not conceal the tears that trickled down their loyal cheeks. For another young Georgia loyalist, news of the peace was, quote, the severest shock our feelings have ever had to struggle with. Deserted as we are by our king, banished by our country, what recourse is left to us in this combination of calamities? The men who not only possessed the necessaries, but all the luxuries of life should become vagrant and be plunged in the torrent of misery and despair by the Parliament of Britain, who, having no further occasion for their services, treat them with contempt and mock their sorrows. We are all cast off. I shall ever, though, remember with satisfaction that it was not I deserted my king, but my king that deserted me. And I wanted to quote those passages in particular because they come from papers here. And the story of East Florida is brilliantly documented in collections here in the Library of Congress. Well, most of the Florida refugees went to the Bahamas. And the reason for that is pretty clearly illustrated in this map. The Bahamas are right there. And they had available land. But the loyalists were, by and large, not very happy to go there. The quality of the land was poor. They didn't see much chance of having a good success with their plantations. And so those few who could afford to do better did, and the Johnstons were among them. They were able to sell off their slaves and use the proceeds of the slave sales to move instead to Britain. Specifically to Scotland, which was the home in Edinburgh of the best medical school in the British world at that time. And William Johnston, who had been training as a medical student before the war, was able to take up his medical studies again in Edinburgh. And so it is that they move again. Elizabeth Johnston has given birth to a different child in every place that she's lived. She goes to Edinburgh, has her fourth child there, enjoys finally being able to set up a kind of family home in a place that they'll stay for a while. But like many of the refugees in Britain, they also feel alienated there. They don't have much money. They don't have many connections. They don't feel that there's a good way forward for them professionally, and they're just living in much more straitened circumstances than they were used to back in the South. And just to kind of compound matters, her youngest child, a son, actually dies in Edinburgh of thrush at the age of 3 months. And so it is that when William Johnston finishes his medical training, they don't consider staying in Britain because they just don't feel that they have the money, they don't feel at home, they don't see professional prospects. And they decide instead to move yet again. And the destination they have in mind is Jamaica. I'll read you a little bit about that. Its beauty could take your breath away. From the sparkling surface of the water, your gaze swept sharply up to the craggy blue mountains, climbing into the clouds. Over the rippled slopes fell a living green blanket, textured in the weird vegetable forms of the tropics. Giant ferns and tufted bromeliads, flap-eared plantains, muscular trees draped in epiphytes, careening stands of bamboo, and sinewy palms. When you turned past the outer lip of the harbor, you floated over the broken stones of the old capital of Port Royal, mostly destroyed in a 1692 earthquake. The gleaming sand swept around the shoreline to Kingston, Port Royal's replacement, the greatest British metropolis in the Caribbean. Gulls sliced circles around the masts, and the sun cut the water into liquid diamonds. No wonder loyalists were captivated by it. Such hills, such mountains, and such verdure, everything so bright and gay, it is delightful, gushed, captivated by it. Such hills, such mountains, and such verdure, everything so bright and gay, it is delightful, gushed one new arrival on cruising toward this spectacular landscape. An 18th century aesthete effusively compared the Bay of Kingston to the Bay of Naples, with the Blue Mountains standing in for Vesuvius and the submerged ruins of Port Royal like a phantom Pompeii under the transparent sea. Others let the grandeur and sublimity simply overcome them, knocking language from their lips. Whatever else loyalist refugees knew of this lush island, they could see it wasn't the 13 colonies anymore. At that time, the colony of Jamaica was the richest place in the British Empire, and it was rich because of its enormous sugar plantations, which sugar was one of the most valuable commodities in the British Empire at that time. And so it was a very promising place on the face of it for refugees to go. I mean, it seemed like, this is the great place you can make a fortune. At the same time, the very things that made Jamaica appealing in some ways also turned out to be problematic. As a tropical island with a tropical climate, it was filled with diseases that were very deadly to the white population. And, William Johnston's a doctor. He can find a lot of work in Jamaica, but it's also a very tricky environment. And this, the sugar economy means that there's an enormous population of slaves on the island and a very tense relationship between the population of slaves and the tiny white minority. We're talking a ratio of maybe 8-to-1 or something, who are living in this climate. And so it turns out that the things that seem appealing about Jamaica actually are not so, Jamaica is not so great. And this is the case for the Johnstons' experience as well. While William Johnston is becoming a great practitioner of medicine to slaves and to whites, they end up trying to grow their family, but soon the diseases of the island turn inward fatally on the Johnston family as well. And they lose another young child to scarlet fever while they're there. You could not avoid death, but you could try to come to terms with it. As if to replace the lost child, the one who had died of scarlet fever called Jane, the Johnstons named their newest infant, born in 1794, Jane Farley, as well. With her, the Johnstons weren't taking any chances. Because of William's constant exposure to smallpox, he arranged to have the baby girl inoculated. Although the procedure had become widespread in Jamaica by then, there was always some risk that rather than developing antibodies to fight off the controlled infection, the patient might contract a fatal case of smallpox instead. Parents anxiously monitored the incisions where the virus had been applied to make sure the infection didn't spread. The second Jane Farley Johnston, just 3 months old, was not so lucky. After lying on my lap for some time on a pillow, a very sad spectacle, one sore being quite black, she died in my arms, her angelic blue eyes never to open again. William carried the small body from Elizabeth's lap, and she collapsed on the floor, convulsed in grief and prayers. She had lost 2 children already, one in Edinburgh, another in Jamaica, but this bereavement touched Elizabeth Johnston more deeply than any other. Perhaps it had something to do with the sense that she could have stopped it, that she had actually approved and probably watched when the fatal germs were applied to her child's soft satin limbs. But to be there in that strange, suffocating place, with nothing familiar around her, quote, having no female relation to be with me, only black servants, unquote, it seemed too much to bear. Quote, much exhausted in mind and body, unquote, she fell into a serious depression. Not long after the baby's death, the Johnstons decided to send another of their daughters to Britain with an adoptive family. We could not for some weeks make up our minds to part with her, Johnston confessed, as they wrestled with a dilemma that faced generations of parents in inhospitable imperial outposts. Was it better to keep the children close to home, exposed to tropical dangers, or to send them thousands of miles home to distant Britain? As the inexorable pressures of mortality closed in around them, the Johnstons discovered Jamaica to be a false refuge. Though William Johnston succeeded where many Southern refugee planters did not, by quickly carving out a successful professional career, the hostility of the alien environment broke down his family both physically and psychologically. In 1796, a debilitated Elizabeth Johnston admitted defeat. She decided to return to Edinburgh with the children as, quote, a duty both to their health and their morals, unquote, while William, who, quote, could not possibly leave his practice, unquote, decided to stay on in Jamaica alone. Fully 40 years later, the grief still welled up inside her when she remembered, quote, the morning of that sad day when I heard that the boat was coming to take us on board for another separation, another Atlantic crossing. I hardly think I was in my senses. I uttered screams that distressed my poor husband to such a degree that he would then have been glad if I had given up going. He begged me to let him go on board and bring our things back, but all I could say was, it is too late. Well, after all of these sad things I've been telling you, it may seem hard to imagine that life could turn out particularly well for someone like Elizabeth Johnston. And the point that I really want to convey to you here is that for these people, these refugees, once their lives had been inverted, it was very hard to put them right again. And this idea of this pattern of moving from place to place to place was one that was shared actually by surprisingly many refugees in this diaspora. And yet, against all of this, against all the trials and tribulations that they experienced, in the end, the loyalists, the refugees did manage to find some kind of contentment. And this would come true for Elizabeth Johnston at last in 1806, 30 years after the Declaration of Independence, when she and her family finally decided to settle in Nova Scotia, which was the #1 destination for loyalist refugees right from the beginning. And so it was that I'd like to end on a somewhat more cheerful note. This is an image from 1812 or so. It's by the Anglo-American painter Benjamin West, and it's called The Reception of the American Loyalists by Great Britain. And you can really see here, I think, the spirit of 1783 kind of brought to life. You see Britannia there, holding out her arm to this crowd of loyalist refugees. They include at the front some well-known white refugees. They're followed, as you see, by a Native American who's kind of the noble savage like this. And there's an accompanying text to this image which explains that he's sheltering a widow and orphans rendered so by the Civil War, quote unquote, as well as a group of Black loyalists there on the side. And so it's an optimistic vision of where things had gotten to, but it's not entirely a false one in as much as it conveys, I think, this sense of the British Empire as an encompassing, embracing entity, if also a hierarchical one with authority very clear. And so it was. I'll read a final paragraph and end with this. Many refugees, especially in British North America, could probably identify with this happy picture. Elizabeth Johnston, at last, was among the contented. By the time Johnston rehearsed the events of her life for her memoirs in 1837, she was 73 years old. Her sight was dimmed by cataracts, and her memory twisted around old traumas like a tree growing around barbed wire. All those movements, all those separations, and so many deaths. She had come of age during a civil war and spent decades of her adult life coping with dislocation and bereavement. Yet there was no anger in Johnston's recollections, nor any nostalgic longing for her lost home. If anything, she sounded rather self-satisfied, for she had rooted herself in a new home now. Little did I think that I and all my family would ultimately settle in Nova Scotia, she recalled. While she achieved a stability and social comfort she had never before known, her surviving children became prominent members of Nova Scotia's professional and political elite, in some cases achieving quite high positions. After all their trials and migrations, the Johnstons had arrived and evolved from American loyalists into British North American patriots. To follow Johnston's narrative, in keeping with Canadian Tory interpretations of this loyalist influx, these losers were actually winners in the end. So I will leave it at that.
You can see the writing on the pavement. Young up at night, yeah. Make all the demons quiet, yeah. We were built to thrive, yeah. I think that we've all had enough. What keeps you up at night, yeah. Make all the demons quiet, yeah. We were built to thrive, yeah. I think that we've all had enough. Oh yeah, I think that we've all had enough. Sick of dealing with the old plan. They know that we're calling it wrong. You got me like, oh yeah, I think that we've all had enough. Sick of dealing with the old plan. They know that we're calling it wrong. Hey, it's too late to try to go contain it. A generation fueled by creation. We live lives on a small screen nation. We control the airwaves, no negotiation. I refuse to think we need saving. Something good will come from creation. And when we think that the world is too anxious, we'll adapt, evolve, survive, and save it. What keeps you up at night, yeah. Make all the demons quiet, yeah. We were built to thrive, yeah. I think that we've all had enough. What keeps you up at night, yeah. Make all the demons quiet, yeah. We were built to thrive, yeah.